I apologize if I return to this well far too often in my preaching, but for those of you who don't know, I am a bivocational pastor. Apart from my time here as a pastor at Res Cov, I also fill the rest of my time doing construction and home repair all around the city for different people. I love improving and creating physical things and through construction, and I love caring for people and doing pastoral work. And I find the differences between these two kinds of work just keeps both jobs really interesting, and it's just the way my body and my brain work. And so when I looked ahead at the lectionary readings for today, my two worlds collided, and I was drawn to this text from Amos, as we just heard. As hard as his words of warning are to hear, and I'll be honest, as hard as they are to preach, I was drawn to this vision of God holding a plumb line against a wall, and I was excited to share these tools I use in construction to get at this vision. But before I do that, as a refresher, in chapter 7, the prophet Amos has 3 visions from God, with more to come in the following chapters. And these visions came from God, but Amos would also use them as rhetorical tools in his prophetic preaching. These visions were like sermon examples or object lessons to get at a point. In verses 1 and 2, Amos sees locusts devour all the grass in the land. In verse 4, Amos sees a shower of fire devour the great deep, as well as all the land. And in verses 7 and 8, Amos sees something like this. This is a plumb line. This is an ancient tool that is still used today. It's used by masons to measure whether they are building a wall perfectly vertical. Once it stops swinging, and it hits that fixed point, it will be sitting directly below the point it is hanging from in the sky. It's pulled downward by gravity, and when it stops, it is pointing directly into the center of the earth. And when that line stops from every direction, it is perfectly plumb. Humans figured this out millennia ago. And I titled this sermon, What is Plumb? And so to answer that question on one level, here is a level. Dad joke, Rome, whatever, I don't care. For years I used this tool in building and stuff, and I would give it to somebody, I would check whether the wall was level. But if you turn it horizontally, that's level. When that bubble is perfectly between those lines, that's level. When you turn it this way, put it against the wall, now you're checking for plumb. So, I hereby commission you to use the proper terminology. This is horizontal, and this is plumb. Go. Sin no more. Amos had a vision, and then God asked what he saw. So humor me for a moment, close your eyes for 30 seconds, and try to imagine. This is what the Lord showed me, writes Amos. The Lord was standing beside a wall. The wall was built with a plumb line. The wall was perfectly vertical. And the Lord had a plumb line in his hand. And the Lord said to me, Amos, what do you see? What do you see? What do you see? And Amos said, I see a plumb line. And then the Lord said, see, I am setting a plumb line in the midst of my people Israel. I will never again pass by them or show them my favor. The high places of Isaac shall be made desolate, and the sanctuaries of Israel shall be laid waste, and I will rise against the house of King Jeroboam with the sword. What do you see? You can open your eyes if you still have them closed. This vision is ultimately prophetic aid to get a point across. The point is, far too many systems and structures that humans have built are out of whack and out of plumb. And specific to Amos, God has set apart Israel and made covenants with them and given them the law to be a light to the nations, to be an example of upright living with God and neighbor, to be an example of plumb line living when the world is out of plumb and out of whack. And Amos, the shepherd farmer, is called by God out of obscurity to tell the powerful priests and kings of the north, you have built a crooked system. The whole thing is out of plumb, and God is willing to tear it all down because it cannot be saved as is. And as a builder, oftentimes, once I get into the bones of a project, I realize that the superficial problem I was asked to solve is actually the result of a larger, unseen problem. It's always a bit awkward when I have to bring the client in and show them the source of the problem, and then give my recommendation, which will ultimately take more time and cost more money. And the decision is ultimately theirs, but I feel I have to do my duty to show them the problem. And Amos, the farmer prophet, is in a far more awkward position. He's telling the religious and political leaders of the north, your whole system is out of whack. You think you are safe from God's judgment, but you are not. God is standing with a plumb line to measure you against, and God is willing to tear the whole thing down because it is far too crooked to save. So how do you think the religious and political leaders felt about Amos? Because we find out right in verse 10, right? A priest named Amaziah living in a town called Bethel, which, pun intended, Bethel means house of God. Amaziah hears Amos, and then he sends a message to the king of the northern tribes, warning him, Amos is conspiring against you. And the priest from the town of God's house does not heed the words of Amos to check if the house is plumb. Instead, he rats out Amos to the king. Because the priest is worried Amos will upset the status quo. In verse 12, Amaziah pleads, tries to silence Amos. O seer, O prophet, go back to the land of Judah in the south. Be a professional prophet to your own people. But do not speak truth to power in this town. For this building is the king's sanctuary. This temple is a temple of the kingdom. Amaziah misses the point. Amaziah misidentifies the sanctuary of God and the temple of God as the king's sanctuary and the temple of the king's kingdom. And it is tragically often the case, the religious powers are so enmeshed with the king or political powers, so comfortable with the status quo that they miss the point. Even more tragic, we forget whose house this is and what we are called to do. It's God's house. And Amos warns, with God holding the plumb line, with God taking measure of how this house is built, this house can no longer stand. It must be demolished, with the distant hope that it can be rebuilt. But the question persists on a deeper theological, prophetic level, what is plumb? What is plumb according to God? How do we measure our world and our city and our relationships and our lives? What is plumb? You'll notice, again, if I push the plumb bob, which this is called the plumb bob, if I push the plumb bob, it's going to take a while for it to settle and really register plumb. But oh wait, I've got the laser level. And I can just turn it on and it immediately gives me perfectly plumb laser, at least on that wall. Not only that, I can turn on this one and boom, I've got a perfectly horizontal line. Going into some of your eyeballs, sorry. I've got a perfectly level line going. Because remember, plumb is working horizontal. It's plumb. Or I have my fancy 6-foot level. I can just take this immediately, hold it up here, and see if it's plumb. It's actually not. It's a little bit off. And I don't have to wait here for this silly plumb line to eventually stop and point directly at the center of the earth. But what if the level gets dropped so many times that it's no longer plumb? No longer plumb. What if this laser level runs out of batteries or cracks? And the levels can only measure one direction at a time. And how are these tools even set to plumb or level anyway? In truth, these fancy new tools are still dependent on the ancient method of measuring plumb: gravity. That constant force that we often forget but depend on every second of our lives. Gravity has been pulling downward at the same strength and the same rate. And the plumb line may take some time to settle and give a true measure, but it is ultimately more reliable and a simpler way to measure things if things are plumb and true. And my point is, it's easy to use shortcuts or fancy ways to measure what is plumb or true. But seeking God's measure takes more time and patience and reflection. As I said, it's hard to preach this. Because notice how Amos, his harshest words, are for the religious leaders. Same with Jesus. That's who he always spoke harshest to. And the church likes to create fancy tools that supposedly quickly show us God's plumb line, don't we? Popular phrases like, "What would Jesus do?" or the purity culture of the 90s that screwed up so many of us. Family-focused organizations or social justice organizations, health and wealth gospel, all manner of formulas for righteous living. But when these fads fade or crack, God's gravity is still pulling at the same strength and the same rate. Seeking God's measure of plumb requires time and patience and reflection. It's good to remember what one podcaster noted in my preparation this week. That the prophet Amos has hard words for everyone. We should assume that if Amos were here preaching today, he would have a hard word for us as well. It can be very easy in the rage-fueled social media age we live in to create our own measure of what is plumb. When the world feels particularly out of whack as it does these days, we can easily latch onto catchphrases or buzzwords or a culture of tribalism that assures us of how right we are and how wrong they are. And don't get me wrong, there's plenty out of whack and out of plumb, and there are plenty of bad actors and bad laws that should be measured and corrected. But the hard part of following Jesus is making sure we set our measure with him. And not some fancy new tool that will quickly delineate who is right and who is wrong. Because oftentimes we want to manipulate that tool so we are right and they are wrong. Maybe the fancy new tool was never plumb to begin with. Maybe God's gravity should be trusted and not the vortex of rage that it is so easy to get stirred up in. So what is plumb? What is God's measure of plumb and true and good? As we heard from Luke 10, if you look there, you find one of the most succinct and cliche answers. A lawyer asked Jesus, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" Essentially asking, what is God's measure of plumb? And Jesus answers, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" And the lawyer answers, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus says, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." That's plumb. Love God and love the people around you. It's not fancy or flashy. Love God and love your neighbor. But like the lawyer, perhaps we need more examples of how to do this. And so the lawyer asks, "And who is my neighbor?" And rather than give him a catchphrase or a buzzword or tribalism, Jesus tells a parable. Jesus tells a story that we are still telling and reflecting on and naming our hospitals after today. And the point of the parable is your neighbor is everyone, even the folks you disagree with. And a neighbor does neighborly things for their neighbor, and the love to do that neighborly good is derived from your love of God. Love God and love your neighbor. That is both plumb and level. It is as profoundly simple as a weight hanging on a string. And here is the real power of loving your neighbor and loving God. When you sit and do the patient reflection, when you take the time to allow God's plumb line to settle, then you come to realize that what is bad for your neighbor will eventually be bad for you. And conversely, what is good for your neighbor is ultimately good for you. In our day when so much seems crooked and out of whack and out of plumb, showing real love for your neighbor, whom you might disagree with, is a courageous act of faith in God's plumb line. When tragedy strikes and so much seems unresolved and looming, like the Samaritan on the road, we bandage the wounds of our neighbor. We pour oil on them to clean them. We care for the pain with wine. We use the strength we have to put them on our own animal. We bring them to safety so that they can heal even more. We use what we have so our neighbor does not languish. Because when we participate in the death and resurrection of Jesus, when we join ourselves to Christ, who is our incarnate plumb line, we dare to join in God's patient work of demolishing what is crooked among us and in us and around us, and we are blessed to join in God's patient and truly plumb rebuilding. May it be so. Amen.